So welcome again. We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to part 2 of the new Data Management and Sharing Policy webinar series, diving deeper into the new DMS policy. My name is Elise Sullivan, and I'll be moderating today's event. And joining us from the Office of Science Policy, we have Taunton Payne, and from the Office of Extramural Research, we have Julia Slutzman and Cindy Danielson. The format for today's session will include a brief recap from part 1 of our webinar series. Then we'll go into a pre-recorded discussion session with our expert panel. And then we'll have about 40 minutes of live Q&A from our audience. And several of you submitted questions in advance of this webinar, and we've incorporated as many of those as we can into our pre-recorded panel discussion. And during the live Q&A portion, we're going to try and get to as many new questions as possible. So while the pre-recorded discussion is playing, we invite you to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box. They'll be located at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and use that Q&A box to let us know what questions you have. Our team will be on the back end compiling these questions, and we'll use those questions to structure our live Q&A portion of the event. And you all will actually be able to help us prioritize those questions using the upvote capability. So you can go ahead and give a thumbs up and upvote any questions that are asked that you think would be helpful. We hope you don't experience any technical or logistical issues, but if you do, go ahead and let us know in that Q&A box, and we'll try and help you out. I did want to mention that this entire session is being recorded and it'll be made available in about a week. We've also put together some resource slides to accompany today's session, and these are available on the NIH sharing site at sharing.nih.gov/about/learning. And in the chat, we can put a direct link for folks to access those slides. Okay, now we're ready to dive in, and let's queue up our pre-recorded panel discussion, and it may just take one moment to load. In today's webinar, we'll be covering additional topics that were not covered in detail in the first webinar, but that we know there's a lot of interest in. We'll be discussing protecting privacy when sharing data from human research participants, the responsible management and sharing of American Indian and Alaska Native participant data, and we'll go into the interaction of the genomic data sharing policy with the data management and sharing policy. We'll also discuss a number of other topics that we have received questions on, such as intellectual property, informed consent, secondary research, and timelines for sharing. We're going to start with a few minutes on the DMS policy basics and a recap of the topics covered in webinar 1. For those who missed our first webinar, we encourage you to view the recording and take a look at the resource slides provided. And as we covered in webinar 1, NIH has long been committed to making the results of research available. And the new DMS policy really promotes the transparency and accountability in research by setting a minimum expectation for data sharing. This means that other policies or IC-specific expectations may build upon this requirement, but this policy does set a consistent baseline across NIH. And in terms of applicability, all research funded in part or whole by NIH that produces scientific data is subject to the policy. And we encourage folks to check out our webpage on research subject to the policy for more specifics. As for the requirements of the policy, they're quite simple. One is that all applications subject to the DMS policy are required to include a DMS plan that details how data will be managed and shared. And 2, that investigators and institutions follow through and comply with the approved plan. In webinar 1, we also discussed how to prepare DMS plans and budget for related costs. As a reminder, DMS plans should describe how the data will be managed and appropriately shared by addressing 6 key elements. And we've provided an optional format page or template that investigators may find helpful in structuring their plans. And we really recommend taking a look at our page on writing a DMS plan for all these details. Regarding costs, you are allowed to request funding to support the data management and sharing activities that you describe in your plan. And we would like to point folks to our page on budgeting for DMS for all these details on the allowable costs and where to put your budget. Finally, we touched on the timing of when data should be shared and factors to consider when selecting a data repository. To remind folks, the policy expects data to be shared no later than the time of publication in a peer-reviewed journal or the end of the award, whichever comes first. We also reviewed a number of resources for finding and selecting an appropriate data repository. These may be helpful when trying to sift through the various options out there. This information can all be found on our Sharing Scientific Data section of our website. In closing, I do want to point out that we have a new DMS policy overview webpage. That's a really great place to start. It walks through the various steps from planning and budgeting to submission and review of plans, and finally in implementing your DMS plan. Again, we do encourage folks to check out the webinar 1 recording and resource slides if you have not done so yet. And with that recap, I'm going to turn to our expert panel to dig into some new topics today. Taunton, let's start by covering any recent developments and resources since part 1 of our webinar series in August. Has anything changed since then?
Yes, there have been several developments since the last webinar that I'd like to mention. NIH has provided several documents that relate to the data management and sharing policy and are intended to provide instructions or helpful guidance. These include a supplemental information relating to best practices for protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data, and another supplemental information on considerations and best practices when conducting research with American Indian and Alaskan Native participants. We also issued a notice about how NIH is harmonizing some aspects of the genomic data sharing policy with the data management and sharing policy, in particular, focusing on how plans for sharing genomic data should be communicated to NIH. The other panelists and I will be discussing these topics in more detail in this webinar. I do want to address one development that I'm sure many on this webinar are aware of and may have questions about. No doubt many of you know that on August 25th, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy published a memo directing all federal agencies that support research, including NIH, to expedite access to results of federally funded research. NIH supports this important step in advancing transparency and accessibility. To be clear, the first requirement is for federal agencies to develop plans in response to this memo, and over the coming months, NIH will work expeditiously to develop and share its plans for implementing the White House directives. What's important to know for today's conversation is that we anticipate that the data management and sharing policy that we're discussing in these webinars is consistent with the directives of the memo, and we do not anticipate making changes to the policy or its implementation.
Thanks for the update. And you mentioned that NIH just released a supplement to the DMS policy on protecting privacy when sharing data from human participants. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And is it introducing any new rules?
So the supplemental information on protecting research participant privacy is the direct result of public comments and requests from the research community for additional clarification from NIH on how to appropriately share data from human research participants under the DMS policy. Let me emphasize first that this supplemental information is not intended to be a guide for compliance with any regulatory requirements, nor is it establishing binding rules for NIH awardees. Researchers must, of course, continue to follow any applicable laws, regulations, and policies related to protecting privacy. Rather, the supplemental information provides a basic framework to help researchers and institutions consider options for protecting privacy when sharing data from human research participants. It's also intended to update and replace guidance that was previously provided under the 2003 data sharing policy. This framework is intended to be broadly applicable for the range of research activities that might be conducted under the data management and sharing policy. So it addresses both identifiable and de-identified information. It's also meant to be considered for different data types and data that may have been collected in different settings.
Thanks, Taunton. And can you summarize for us some of the best practices that are laid out in this resource?
Sure. So I want to start by mentioning that the supplemental information provides one set of best practices and acknowledges that there may be other strategies for implementing the principles and protecting privacy. The supplemental information provides three basic best practices that are intended to be implemented together. First, NIH recommends that scientific data be de-identified to the greatest extent that maintains sufficient scientific utility, and data should generally be shared only in de-identified form. We've indicated that the appropriate standard for de-identification by default should be meeting the standards in both the Common Rule and the HIPAA Privacy Rule, even if these rules do not technically apply to the sharing and subsequent research use of the data.
And are there any examples or resources for de-identification that we can point people to?
The supplemental information provides a few examples of relevant tools, such as the National Library of Medicine's Clinical Text De-Identification tool. But regarding de-identification, the supplemental information also acknowledges that there may be cases where certain types of potentially identifying information may not be sufficiently addressed by applying the regulatory standards for de-identification. For example, certain types of information, even when de-identified from a regulatory perspective, may increase the risk of identifiability of research participants by allowing inferences to be made about a participant's identity when combined with other information. This can sometimes be a challenge for certain types of data, including some types of qualitative data. For example, in a focus group or interview, a participant might share details from their personal life that could increase the risk of re-identification, even if it meets a regulatory definition for being de-identified. Researchers should consider the appropriateness of modifying this type of information or sharing data only through controlled access. We recognize that in some cases, scientific utility may be lost if shared data are de-identified, so it may be appropriate to share data that meet a regulatory definition of identifiability when there is explicit consent to do so, and if all other applicable legal and regulatory requirements for sharing such data are met. As another best practice, NIH recommends using agreements for sharing scientific data. These agreements help make clear the appropriate uses for downstream users, especially in cases where access is controlled. We've provided a few elements that we think are important to include in such agreements, including actually communicating that the institution sharing the data considered the risks associated with doing so, generally prohibiting any attempt to re-identify or recontact participants or their family members, and actually communicating any limitations on subsequent use.
Thanks, Taunton. And does NIH provide any example agreements for folks to reference?
Good question. And we heard a number of comments requesting that NIH provide standard agreements. We do provide in a supplemental information as an example, the data use and transfer agreements developed by the Federal Demonstration Partnership. And we may provide a template form in the future that includes these elements specifically. The last thing I'll mention as part of the best practices is that the supplemental information reminds institutions that they really need to understand the federal, tribal, state, and local laws that may apply to their research and may restrict disclosure or set requirements for sharing scientific data, such as the Common Rule, HIPAA, or certain state laws. In particular, we want to ensure that researchers understand when the data they share may be protected by certificates of confidentiality, and that users of data protected by a certificate are aware of those protections.
Thanks. And since you just mentioned certificates of confidentiality, let's take a moment to review what those are and how they relate to the DMS policy. Julia, could you give us a summary?
Certainly. The bottom line is that scientific data may be protected by a certificate of confidentiality, and data protected by certificates can be shared in a manner consistent with those protections. So the protections offered by certificates of confidentiality are not a barrier to the kinds of responsible data sharing envisioned in the DMS policy. To give just a bit of background for those not familiar with them, certificates of confidentiality help researchers protect the privacy of research participants' data by prohibiting disclosure of identifiable sensitive information, including in response to a subpoena or court orders. The NIH Certificates of Confidentiality policy applies to all biomedical, behavioral, clinical, or other research funded wholly or in part by NIH that collects or uses identifiable sensitive information. Certificates provide protection in perpetuity. NIH and other federal agencies issue certificates of confidentiality under authorities from the Public Health Service Act and the 21st Century Cures Act. Institutions and their investigators are responsible for determining whether the research is subject to the policy and are responsible for ensuring that no information is disclosed unless permitted under the terms of a certificate of confidentiality. It's important to note that there are certain specific situations where identifiable data protected by a certificate can be disclosed, such as when a research participant voluntarily discloses the information, or when the disclosure is made for research purposes, or when mandatory reporting requirements apply to researchers. I encourage you to refer to the NIH Grants Policy website for more detailed information about certificates of confidentiality.
Thanks, Julia. And getting back to the supplemental information on protecting privacy, Taunton, you've mentioned that some data could be shared through controlled access. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yes, the data management and sharing policy encourages researchers to actually consider whether scientific data should be shared through controlled access, even if de-identified. We heard a number of questions regarding what constitutes controlled access, when data should be shared that way, and when data can be shared openly. The policy does not provide a definition of controlled access, and the exact method for controlling access may vary, but it generally consists of sharing data in a manner that requires review of appropriateness of requests to use data. Factors to consider for whether access to scientific data should be controlled include if there are explicit limitations on subsequent use, such as for laws, informed consent, or agreements. If data might be considered particularly sensitive due to the ability to cause individual or group harm. If data cannot be de-identified to the standards described in the best practices and the possibility of re-identification cannot be sufficiently reduced, or if previously unanticipated methods or technologies emerge that might pose risks to participant privacy. The supplemental information also provides factors to consider in determining whether to share data openly, including if participants have explicitly consented to sharing their data that way, and if scientific data are de-identified and institutional review determines that sharing would pose very low risk to the research participants.
Thanks, Taunton. And are there situations where researchers may need to do something different from what's described in the privacy supplement?
Yes, definitely. We've acknowledged that the best practices and the considerations for sharing data that are provided in the supplemental information are just one way to protect privacy. In some cases, there may be laws or even NIH policies that must be followed. In particular, the NIH Genomic data sharing policy sets expectations for the sharing of data, such as for how investigators should de-identify human genomic data, submit data to specific controlled access repositories, and investigator responsibilities for the secondary use of these data. In those cases, we would expect researchers to follow those expectations.
Thank you. Now let's turn to the supplemental information on the responsible management and sharing of American Indian and Alaska Native participant data. So Taunton, can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of this resource and how it was developed?
Yes. So ultimately, this supplemental information is intended to assist researchers in developing an appropriate data management and sharing plan when conducting research with American Indian and Alaska Native tribes. And it emphasizes respect for tribal sovereignty and trust building between researchers and tribes regarding data management and sharing practices. It seeks to accomplish this by providing certain considerations for researchers, which include contextual information and related approaches that researchers should really familiarize themselves with. And it provides best practices for researchers to mitigate potential risks to tribes and their members, such as group harm and stigmatization, and facilitate respectful and mutually beneficial partnerships with tribes. The supplemental information was developed in response to tribal nations' input received through a formal tribal consultation on the data management and sharing policy that began in 2019 through engagement with the NIH Tribal Advisory Committee and tribal leaders, and with input from public comments from a variety of stakeholders.
Thanks, Taunton. So next, can you give us an overview of the recommended best practices in this resource?
Yes, a critical part of the supplemental information is promoting an understanding of the importance of tribal sovereignty among researchers and the unique rights sovereignty affords to tribes to create and enforce rules for research and sharing of scientific data. Researchers must comply with any applicable requirements and processes set by the tribe for conducting research and sharing scientific data, such as review by tribal designated IRBs or research review committees. There's another critical best practice, which is reinforcing the importance of proactive, early discussion and clear communication between researchers and tribal nations about data management and sharing plans that should continue throughout the research process, which of course is also valuable for any research, not just projects involving tribal nations. Establishing partnerships to engage tribes in planning for data management and sharing before research begins helps to ensure an opportunity to align data sharing practices with tribal laws, policies, and preferences, and to consider additional protections that may be needed. In some cases, limitations on sharing scientific data may be needed by applicable laws, regulations, policies, and agreements that may govern the sharing of data. Researchers should make efforts to safeguard against risks to tribes and their members by planning for appropriate protections, such as consideration of whether a tribe may include a unique population at greater risk of re-identification or stigmatization. There's another important consideration for researchers and tribes, which is to determine together, while planning for data management and sharing, whether data will be managed by tribal nations, by researchers, or by a trusted third party. As we've mentioned, the policy strongly encourages the use of established data repositories, and NIH has provided a set of desirable characteristics for repositories, but the policy does not require use of a specific repository or indicate who should oversee it. A point to consider that is not unique to research with tribes, but still important for this context, is that researchers should ensure that consent processes reflect their plans for data management and sharing. There's more detail in the supplemental information than I'm able to go over today, so I encourage you to read it if it could be relevant for your research.
Thank you, Taunton. Another topic that I wanted to touch on today is the interaction between the genomic data sharing policy and the new DMS policy. So Julia, can you start by giving us a brief overview of the GDS policy for any folks who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. The GDS policy went into effect in 2015. It sets forth expectations for the timely and responsible sharing of NIH-funded research generating large-scale human or non-human genomic data through an NIH-designated repository, as well as for the use of genomic data for secondary research. I want to note that individual ICs may have additional expectations to those articulated in the NIH-wide GDS policy. NIH expects applicants who apply for NIH funding for research that generates large-scale genomic data to describe how the data will be shared in a data sharing plan. Investigators generating large-scale human genomic data are required to submit a submission agreement called an institutional certification to NIH at just in time. Data from research subject to the GDS policy is available through NIH designated repositories, including both controlled access repositories and unrestricted access repositories. Investigators who would like to use controlled access data submit a data access request to do so. If NIH approves the request to access data, the GDS policy articulates a number of responsibilities that investigators and their institutions must uphold to safeguard and use data responsibly. These responsibilities, detailed information, FAQs, and guidance about the GDS policy are available on the sharing.nih.gov website. Finally, I do want to highlight one important distinction about the scope of the GDS policy, which I was just discussing, and the DMS policy. The GDS policy has a broader scope as it articulates expectations for sharing of genomic data and also sets forth expectations for accessing data covered by the policy, whereas the DMS policy does not establish expectations for access to and secondary use of scientific data.
Thanks, Julia. And will the GDS policy continue to apply to research that is also subject to the DMS policy?
Yes, research subject to the GDS policy as well as the DMS policy will need to meet the expectations of both policies. In response to input from the community, NIH has taken steps to harmonize requirements across both policies and reduce burden for applicants and grantees whose research is subject to both policies.
Thanks. And can you talk a little bit more about how these policies interact and what somebody should be considering if their research is subject to both policies?
Sure. NIH recently published a guide notice describing some implementation updates to the GDS policy as part of the harmonization of the two policies. I want to briefly review the areas highlighted in that notice. First, a separate genomic data sharing plan will no longer be required for research subject to both policies once the DMS policy goes into effect on January 25th, 2023. Considerations for sharing genomic data subject to the GDS policy will be described as part of the single data management and sharing plan submitted at the time of application. We have more detailed guidance available on the sharing.nih.gov website for helping you complete the elements of the DMS plan to meet specific GDS policy expectations. Second, the process for plan assessment by peer reviewers for research subject to both policies will also change to support harmonization. Under the DMS policy, data management and sharing plans are not reviewed by peer reviewers. This is because considerations for sharing genomic data will be communicated through the DMS plan, and peer reviewers will not be asked to comment on the DMS plan, nor will they factor the DMS plan into the overall impact score. The DMS plan will be assessed by NIH program staff. The other area that I want to highlight is budget considerations for genomic data sharing costs. The budget should include required costs for genomic data management and sharing, a brief summary of the DMS plan, and a description of all requested data management and sharing costs must be included within the budget justification attachment. Fourth, compliance for awards subject to the GDS policy will be handled in accordance with the compliance and enforcement terms in the DMS policy. We do not expect that this will result in any significant change in how non-compliance is enforced. Finally, regarding the timing of sharing data, the GDS policy expectations have not changed. GDS policy guidance describes some specific submission timelines for sharing data is detailed on the website. However, it is important to note that harmonization with the DMS policy means that the end of the performance period is the latest possible date to submit data in compliance with the data sharing plan.
Thanks, Julia. And you mentioned that a single DMS plan should be submitted. Can you talk a little bit more about how folks should be incorporating considerations for genomic data?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, for applications with receipt dates on or after January 25th, 2023, subject to both policies, a single data management and sharing plan should be submitted at the time of funding application. That plan must meet both GDS policy and DMS policy expectations, such as when and where genomic data will be shared. I want to note that the GDS policy has expectations for certain data that may not meet the definition of scientific data. To support investigators developing data management and sharing plans, we have updated the instructions for completing DMS plans on the NIH Scientific Data Sharing website, and we call out where to address considerations specific to data types shared under the GDS policy. Let me give you an example. One DMS plan element that requires additional considerations for research subject to both policies is the element addressing access, distribution, or reuse considerations. Researchers using human data will need to consider the content of the informed consent as it relates to future use and subsequent data sharing, and anticipate any potential data use limitations that may result in accordance with the criteria in the institutional certification. This gives applicants the opportunity to explain in their DMS plan if they anticipate that there are criteria in the institutional certification that cannot be met, and indicate what data, if any, can be shared and how they plan to enable data sharing to the maximum extent possible. For example, in certain cases, it may be appropriate to share data in a summary format. In some instances, the funding NIH ICO may need to determine whether to grant an exception to the data submission expectation under the GDS policy.
So Julia, informed consent has come up in a number of contexts today. Can you discuss what the DMS policy expects regarding informed consent, and if there's any expectations of broad consent?
Sure. The DMS policy does not set any additional expectations for informed consent beyond what is required by the Common Rule, HIPAA, and the GDS policy. The DMS policy does recognize the importance of informed consent, and NIH encourages investigators to consider how to address and communicate plans for data sharing during the informed consent process. You also asked about broad consent, Elise. The DMS policy does not expect the use of broad consent and does not set the expectation that the informed consent given by participants should be obtained in any particular way. The policy recognizes that limitations to data sharing that are based on the content of the informed consent process may be needed, and when applicable, these should be described in the DMS plan. Additionally, 3 of the supplemental information notices to the DMS policy that Taunton referred to earlier affirm certain principles and best practices related to honoring informed consent. First, the notice discussing selecting a data repository for data from NIH-supported research discusses that repositories should have the ability to restrict access and use of data sets to those uses that are consistent with participants' informed consent. The notice related to protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data includes as a principle that researchers and institutions develop robust consent practices. Finally, NIH has developed a resource for investigators which reflects input from a wide range of stakeholders and which suggests points to consider when communicating plans for sharing data and biospecimens, and also includes modifiable sample informed consent language.
Thanks, Julia. Next, I'd like to turn our attention to proprietary considerations and intellectual property. Taunton, can you talk to us a little bit about how these issues are addressed in the DMS policy?
Sure. So I want to start by emphasizing that under the DMS policy, researchers are expected to maximize appropriate sharing of scientific data, and scientific data are expected to be shared at the time of publication or by the end of the period of performance, whichever comes first. However, NIH understands that some research, for example, collaborations with the private sector, may introduce questions about how and when to share scientific data when there are intellectual property or proprietary considerations. And the DMS policy addresses these issues in several ways. First, research collaborators or co-funders may ask applicants or awardees to sign agreements that restrict how researchers share scientific data. NIH has indicated that award recipients are responsible for ensuring that any research partnerships allow for compliance with relevant NIH policies, including the DMS policy's expectations for maximizing appropriate sharing. Data sharing expectations should be established prior to the initiation of a partnership, whenever feasible, and any limitations to sharing should be described in plans. In other cases, providers of materials or data needed to conduct research can sometimes impose restrictions on sharing that are not based in informed consent or participant privacy. And NIH has indicated that such agreements may be potentially justifiable, but researchers are advised to consult with the NIH Institute Center or office funding their research to determine how to comply with applicable data sharing expectations. In general, the policy emphasizes prospective planning, and researchers should plan for how they will manage any intellectual property arising from the research, given the timelines for sharing data provided in the policy. If for some reason a change is required to a timeline in an approved data management and sharing plan, researchers should consult their program officer to determine whether the data management and sharing plan should be modified. Finally, I want to make the point that limitations on sharing that involve withholding data for general, unspecified intellectual property interests would generally not be consistent with the policy's goals of maximizing appropriate sharing. As with all plans that propose limitations on data sharing, NIH program staff will review the reasonableness of proposed limitations when they assess the data management and sharing plans.
Thanks, Taunton. And what about NIH Small Business Awards? Are there certain considerations for this type of research?
Yes, so NIH has indicated that under the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Program Policy Directive, SBIR and STTR awardees may withhold applicable data for 20 years after the award date, as stipulated in the specific SBIR or STTR funding agreement and consistent with achieving program goals. SBIR and STTR awardees may retain the rights to data generated during the performance of an SBIR or STTR award for up to 20 years after the award date, per the program policy directive. So an acceptable data management and sharing plan can reference and incorporate these data rights.
Thanks. Let's dig into limitations on sharing a little bit. So Cindy, we've described a number of situations today where researchers might propose to limit the sharing in their data management and sharing plan. Can you talk a little bit about how these limitations will be reviewed by NIH?
Great question. As we know that researchers and institutions are interested in understanding how their DMS plans will be assessed and what happens if something in their DMS plan is not found to be acceptable. I'd like to point out a recent guide notice where we provided some details on implementation of the DMS policy. We noted here that program staff at the proposed NIH Institute, Center, or office will be looking at completeness and reasonableness. That is, ensuring that the elements of a DMS plan have been adequately addressed and assessing the reasonableness of those responses. This includes an assessment of any proposed limitations on sharing stated in the DMS plan. Applications selected for funding will only be funded when program staff determine that the DMS plan is complete and acceptable. This is not a one-size-fits-all process because the determination of whether a specific data management or sharing strategy is acceptable depends on the context. Each DMS plan will be assessed within the context of the proposed research project. In terms of limitations, NIH has clarified some potential examples of justifiable factors that may limit the sharing of data in an FAQ. The specific factors that may limit sharing will vary by project, and the goal of mentioning these up front is to ensure that any limitations have been considered from the beginning. The goal is to maximize appropriate sharing. So when NIH program staff are assessing a specific DMS plan, they will be looking at whether that DMS plan appropriately considers and describes these factors.
Thanks, Cindy. So now let's turn to the timeline for data sharing. We covered this topic in webinar 1, but we've received some questions I want to elaborate about a couple of things. So Cindy, can you walk us through what counts as publication for the purposes of the DMS policy?
Good question, since I know that timing is on the top of everyone's minds, especially for those of you who have been thinking about the White House memo that Taunton mentioned earlier. As a reminder, the DMS policy applies both to scientific data underlying peer-reviewed journal articles and to scientific data underlying findings not disseminated through peer-reviewed journal articles. In all cases, scientific data should be made accessible as soon as possible, but there are some time points for when this should happen. We've clarified these time points in an FAQ. In terms of articles published during the award period, scientific data underlying peer-reviewed journal articles should be made accessible no later than the time of publication. Publication is defined as the date on which the article is first made available in print or electronic format. That is the earlier of those dates if they differ.
Thanks, Cindy. And we know that many researchers are taking advantage of preprints. Does posting a draft of an article on a preprint server trigger this data sharing expectation like it would with a publication?
Only a peer-reviewed journal article triggers the data sharing expectation during an award. That means that NIH's DMS policy does not require the scientific data underlying a preprint to be made accessible when the preprint is posted. However, scientific data underlying findings that are not disseminated in peer-reviewed journal articles should be shared by the end of your award, which may include data underlying preprints. You should also keep in mind that preprint servers may have their own requirements to share data upon preprint posting, and likewise, repositories storing your data may also have their own requirements for public release of data upon preprint posting. While these are not NIH expectations under the DMS policy, they are something that researchers should be prepared for.
Thank you. And we've received a number of questions regarding the use of existing data or secondary data analysis. Taunton, can you help clarify sharing expectations in these cases?
Yes, and there's a couple relevant scenarios to consider. A common situation is when researchers are accessing data that have already been shared, such as through a repository. We've provided an FAQ on this, and I want to state clearly that the primary data that researchers accessed from repositories or that have already been shared in some way are not expected to be shared again. There's a number of reasons for this, including that we do not want to create duplicated records and increase storage burden unnecessarily. However, we also recognize that there may be scientific data generated by analyzing the primary data, and the policy would generally expect researchers to maximize appropriate sharing of these data. Researchers should be aware in those cases that repositories sometimes place restrictions on the ability to share derived data sets, and those limitations should be described in plans. More careful consideration is required when researchers use primary data that have not been shared, either that they maintain themselves or that they obtained from another source. Although the policy emphasizes prospective planning for managing and sharing data generated in research, researchers should consider, when the research is based on actual analyses of primary data that have not been shared, whether sharing their scientific data will provide sufficient context for users. Even though it may not be expected by the policy, in some cases it may be possible and valuable to share primary data that were not generated under the award, taking into account potentially limiting ethical, legal, or technical factors that we've discussed before, such as informed consent, privacy, and agreements governing the use of primary data. And when primary data are used, it's also an important best practice to appropriately cite primary data, even if they aren't shared.
Thanks, Taunton. Okay, I've got one more question for the panel before we go to our live Q&A segment. In the last webinar, we discussed how the DMS policy will apply to research awards leading to the generation of scientific data. Is there any more detail that we can share to help folks determine if the DMS policy applies to them?
Yes, great question, since at our last webinar, we did mention that this was coming. As a reminder, the DMS policy applies to research that results in the generation of scientific data. NIH has finalized the list of activity codes that will be subject to the DMS policy and posted this on the sharing site in the section about research covered under the data management and sharing policy. As an example of what is included, you'll see many activity codes starting with R, as most research projects will be subject to the DMS policy. Also subject to the DMS policy are certain career development awards, or Ks, small business research, including SBIR and STTR, and research centers. I'll also mention some examples that you won't find on the list because they support non-research projects or research projects not generating scientific data. The DMS policy does not apply to activities such as training, fellowships, construction, conference grants, resources, and infrastructure development. This list might be helpful if you are doing some early planning and want to understand whether your application will require submission of a data management and sharing plan. You'll need to refer to the application guide and the specific funding opportunity announcement that you're responding to for detailed application instructions. It's also worth noting that some NIH institutes, centers, offices, or programs may have additional data sharing expectations, and these requirements would also be indicated in the funding opportunity announcement. But we know some of you want to see this policy applicability at a high level, even before you've identified a specific announcement. So feel free to take a look at the list now to get an early idea of what will be needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, panel. And now we're going to turn to our live audience to take some additional Q&As. Hello. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that segment and that you were able to hang with us through a little bit of technical difficulties. So thanks for hanging in there. We are going to bring up, I think my favorite part of the session is we're going to bring in all of our panelists and some additional Q&A folks to answer your questions live. So we had asked you to use the Q&A box. Our team has been behind the scenes compiling them and sorting them into topics. And so we are going to try and get through as many as we can. And then at the end, we will go through just a couple of resources and where to go for more information before we close. So, hey, Duran, can you put back up the slides? I just wanted to do a quick introduction of folks. Actually, we can skip that part. I'll just use folks here on the screen. So you all remember our core panelists, and joining us from OER, from the Office of Extramural Research as well, we have Kasima Garst and Carrie Mitchell, and they're going to be joining us to help answer some additional questions. All right. See, a question that came up early that got a lot of votes was regarding kind of budget. It was stated previously that, that grants are not going to get larger, additional funds would not be available to support data management and sharing efforts. But there's been some uncertainty about this. Taunton, can you talk to us about this question and about sort of the amount of funding that's available for this?
Sure. So I'll just say briefly, I think, there may be sort of two questions here, one about sort of funding generally and one kind of about budget caps. So, first, I think the agency already provides, many resources to support data management and sharing, included, in the form of sort of repositories and tools, sometimes things like, specific funding announcements to support data sharing for certain types of research. We certainly plan to continue doing that, and I think have stated pretty clearly in the past that we will be, actually assessing data management and sharing costs, going forward to determine sort of, the actual appropriate level of resources that will be needed in the future. But let me turn to my opera colleagues to sort of address the question about budget caps that I think might have been part of this as well.
Sure, yes. So I'll just echo what Taunton just said. Some of that is being looked at as we move forward with the data sharing resource plans and looking into all of the costs that we expect to have. We currently do not have budget caps set. We are looking into that internally, and we'll certainly send that out to the community as soon as we have more information on anything related to the cost or the budget.
Thank you. Turning to some of our data management and sharing plans, that in one of the element 6 called oversight of data management and sharing, the question is, who is expected to actually oversee this plan? Is it sort of internal folks on the research team? Is it an external party? Taunton, do you want to start with this?
Sure, and I might turn it over, to my OER colleagues afterwards to see if they want to add anything. But in the last element of the recommended elements of the DMS plan, there's a section for sort of oversight of data management and sharing. And in that, we've asked applicants to sort of, indicate how compliance with the plans will be monitored and managed, the frequency and oversight, and by whom, such as titles and roles. The DMS policy does not set sort of specific, parameters on who this role should be within an organization. So there is, I think, some flexibility for institutions, to actually determine who should fulfill this role for their projects and who would be sort of best actually situated to do that. I don't know if any of my OER colleagues want to, add anything to that.
All right, hearing none, I will move on. Let's see. We received a question about costs for data storage. There is also a question about whether NIH will be developing any kind of central depository, kind of like PubMed, for data. Taunton, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned earlier, NIH actually already has a pretty robust ecosystem of repositories just that are managed, within the agency. This is, sort of, I think kind of growing over time as well. There are some resources available on the sharing.nih.gov website to help sort of locate some of those. I think particularly ones, that NIH actually, operates and manages. And of course, there are many more that NIH does not. There are many, and so I don't think there's necessarily going to be a sort of central resource, since some of these are pretty specialized resources. But I think certainly, there may be more sort of efforts aimed at kind of interoperability and sort of findability across the existing resources, as well as building out, capacity.
Thanks. We're going to turn to a couple of questions about research with human participants. A question here about NIH's expectations if consent was not obtained at all, or if consent was obtained but did not include consent for sharing beyond the research team. Taunton, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. So I think it's important also to sort of differentiate here between the data management and sharing policy and the genomic data sharing policy that we talked about, since the GDS policy actually has sort of fairly specific expectations for consent and what's expected to be in that, and how it will be obtained. The data management and sharing policy, by contrast, does not sort of set specific, consent expectations, and it would not necessarily prohibit sharing of data that are obtained under a waiver of consent. And it also doesn't set expectations for what type of consent should be obtained, but it does strongly encourage that people will obtain actual informed consent for future research use and a sharing of their scientific data, and also really encourages, in the supplemental information that we were discussing earlier, that institutions really should actually develop robust consent practices that actually address data sharing and to plan for consent while they're developing their data management and sharing plans. We've also, I think, indicated in the policy and in the frequently asked questions that limitations in consent, either prospectively obtained or from existing informed consent, can be potentially justifiable reasons for limiting sharing of scientific data. And last, I do want to mention, I think we've probably mentioned it during today's webinar, and we probably mentioned it at the last one as well, but we did release a resource earlier this year that's intended to help sort of develop informed consent as it relates to data sharing, that includes things like, suggested language and, points to consider for when you're developing, consent resources.
Thanks. All right, next question. How can folks reconcile data sharing with confidentiality? We know those, can be at odds. So, for example, proprietary constructs that cannot be shared with the public, or disclosure of proprietary reagents. Taunton, we'll start with you again.
Sure. So I think we've addressed this to some extent during the webinar itself when we talked about sort of proprietary considerations that can emerge, in certain kinds of research. I think sort of particularly when there are research partnerships or in the form of things like agreements that would be needed to obtain materials used in research that may impose limitations on sort of subsequent use of data. In general, I think sort of any limitations, would need to be disclosed in plans, and that those plans would be, assessed by NIH program staff. Because of the specific aspect of this question, talking about proprietary reagents, I do want to also make you aware of the NIH Research Resource Policy and the NIH Model Organism Policy, both of which are also described on the sharing.nih.gov website. And those also apply to sort of physical objects and have certain expectations in there related to the management of intellectual property and proprietary considerations. I do want to also sort of reinforce that the data management and sharing policy does not apply to physical objects. And so I think it may be important to consult both of those policies as well.
Great. We've got a question about how the data sharing requirements apply to research data that do not meet the common rule definition of human subjects, but do involve data derived from human participants. Taunton, to you.
Sure, thanks. So I think this is pretty straightforward. The policy applies to research that is subject to the common rule, as well as research that is not subject to the common rule. And in some cases, scientific data could potentially meet the definition of identifiable private information, and the use of it might be considered, human subjects research, sort of under the common rule. But it would also apply, in cases where it might not meet that definition and might not be subject to the common rule. And so the supplemental information for protecting privacy while sharing human research participant data that we went through in some detail in the webinar is intended to sort of address both situations, both for data that have been sort of derived from human research participants, but I think kind of regardless of whether it's sort of technically subject to the common rule or not. So there are sort of a number of specific considerations in there that I think would be relevant in this situation.
Thanks. All right, we'll stop picking on you, Taunton. We'll the next question is regarding IRB review. So it's not required, at the submission of grant proposals. So what if the IRB doesn't agree with what was proposed in the DMS plan? Should folks be considering modifying? Juliet, can we start with you here?
Sure. So the policy allows for the DMS plan to be revised for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons can certainly be issues raised, determinations made by the IRB. So researchers would need to revise their DMS plan and then discuss those revisions with program staff, who would then be designated with reviewing and approving the plan.
Okay, thanks. We have a similar question, Julia. We're going to hit you up again. When submitting an institutional certification under the GDS policy, can the institutional certification be updated as a result of changes that occur throughout the course of a research project?
So the institutional certifications, which unlike the DMS plans are submitted, the institutional certifications are submitted just in time. The DMS plans are submitted at the time of application. The institutional certification is explicitly designed to reflect institutional review. So if there is a reason for that document to be changed, investigators should also make sure that there's alignment between the data management and sharing plan and the content of the institutional certification, and they should align. And so both would need to be updated as needed if changes are made and then reviewed by NIH staff.
Thank you. Another question here about human participants. So do participants have the right to opt out of broad sharing? And if they object to what is proposed in the consent, does that mean that they should not be recruited for the study? Let's see. Taunton, do you want to start here?
Sure, yeah. So, I think we've been clear in FAQs, that the DMS policy does not require that consent be obtained in any particular way, such as through broad consent. And I think it's really important for us to, actually acknowledge that research needs to include populations that are crucial to meet, scientific objectives. And that's really, I think, a concept that's, behind some of the supplemental information that we've provided as well. But we've noted that limitations on sharing stemming from informed consent are potentially justifiable reasons for limiting sharing of data. And I want to say that very clearly, so we all are, on the same page about that. And I think the FAQ that we have about, appropriate limitations for sharing talks about both when it's sort of prospectively obtained and when it's, for sort of like actually existing consent.
Great, thanks. Let's see, we have some questions on agreements and transferring data. So who should be involved in these agreements? Is it every individual who might be given the data? Is it a whole data set, when a public paper is published? Taunton, could you start with that one?
Sure, and I want to sort of, caveat my answer by saying that I think it would be, potentially fairly context specific, in terms of what the transfer actually is and who it's between. But in general, the points that I think we've made in the supplemental information for protecting research participant privacy, where we talk about, agreements that should cover the transfer of data. We don't recommend a specific individual or institutional components that would necessarily fill that role. But we do, I think, sort of introduce a distinction between, agreements for submitting data to repositories and agreements for obtaining data from repositories. And that, agreements would generally be sort of warranted in both situations. So you could have, certain parties would be, the researcher and the actual data repository. And when data are shared between researchers, I think in that case, agreements would, I think, also be sort of valuable there too.
Great, thanks. Let's see. We have received some questions about data management and sharing plans and the format of them. Is the format page a requirement or other formats allowed? Cindy, do you want to take this one?
Sure. And so we have, NIH has published a format page, which is an optional or recommended way to format the information that we're looking for, the elements of a DMS plan. That is not required. So there may be other ways to represent the information as long as it does cover all the elements, and that will be accepted. But if you're looking for somewhere to start, especially for folks where this is new to you writing such a plan, then you might want to take a look at the format page. It just steps you through the elements of a DMS plan to make sure that you are not forgetting anything, because we do need that information so that those plans can be assessed appropriately.
Great, thanks. We've got another question about timing. When thinking about the requirement to make all data publicly available by the end of the award, how is the end of the award defined? Is it the original end date? Does it include any data that are resulting in a period of no cost extension? Cindy, can we start with you?
Sure. So yes, the definition for the end of the award or the performance period, that would change if you do receive a no cost extension, for example, or a competitive renewal. And so it is the end of the project period. In case of a no cost extension, that's your date by which, if you haven't shared data already, and that's another thing to keep in mind, you shouldn't be holding things back to the end of your award. Data should be made accessible as soon as possible. So if your data underlie results in the publications, then that should be shared at the time of publication. But for other things that do meet the definition of scientific data, if you have findings that have not been published, then those would need to be shared no later than the end of award. And that is the specific question here. What exactly is that date? And that would include any no cost extensions there. And then just to reiterate another point, and I think we did cover this in the first webinar as well, if you do have a competitive renewal of a project, you need to look at whether you were able to complete your what you anticipated in your original approved plan and update that as necessary. Yeah, so I'll just end there.
Thanks, Cindy. Let's see, we have a question about, is de-identification required in order to share the data? Taunton, do you want to talk us through this?
Sure. So I think, there's a couple of considerations here. So first off, I want to say that as I said a number of times, the common rule, the HIPAA privacy rule, these might all apply, to your research and might set certain expectations, and we would, expect you to continue to follow them. In the supplemental information for best practices, which we would sort of expect you to, follow, as well as those laws and regulations, we've actually addressed the issue of de-identification by sort of recommending that data be de-identified to the greatest extent possible using the actual regulatory standard stated in the common rule and in the HIPAA privacy rule. This is not a requirement, but it is a recommendation, and we do acknowledge that there may be some cases where it may be, appropriate to share certain kinds of information that may be, potentially identifiable. But I think the two sort of, key considerations there that we've talked about in that supplemental information, in those cases, are that, if there's sort of, actual explicit consent to do so, and if the if you've actually complied with all sort of other regulatory and policy expectations that might be in place.
Thank you. And there's a few questions about the American Indian, Alaska Native supplemental information. So are these resources only applicable to tribes, or does it apply to anyone where a participant kind of selects or self-identifies as an American Indian or Alaska Native?
So the supplemental information that we talked about earlier today really focuses on, sort of when you're working with, sovereign tribal nations, but I think we have sort of acknowledged in it that there may be, aspects of it that I think are, quite relevant for when you're working with other groups and other sort of indigenous communities as well. And so they may not all have, necessarily the same expectations when it comes to things like tribal laws, but they may be relevant in those cases too.
Great, thanks. All right, some really great questions here. Ava's mentioned that the DMS plans are not reviewed by the scientific review panel, but rather by NIH program officers. Does this imply that there will be a scientific score and then separately a review of the DMS plans? How does that work, Cindy?
Sure, happy to explain that. And this will be different than what happens now with resource sharing plans. This will be a new part of the application for these data management and sharing plans. And we did clarify this recently in a guide notice. I thought it should be included in the resource deck, but I can sum up what we've said in there. And that is that the plans are assessed by NIH program staff, not peer reviewers. And the program staff will be looking at these plans to make sure that the elements have been adequately addressed and look at the reasonableness of those responses, given this specific type of science that is being proposed. This is all within the context of the research project. And during peer review, the peer reviewers are not looking at the plans. They are looking at the budget that is being requested. And when NIH will be putting out comprehensive application instructions this fall, and so you'll see in there exactly what information you should be putting in the budget section. And that budget aspect of data management and sharing is what peer reviewers will be looking at, but the plan itself will be assessed by NIH program staff.
Thank you. Let's see, we have another question here. Clinical trial data is often not fully de-identified. The question is, should all clinical data be shared under controlled access? Taunton, can we start with you?
Yeah, great. So I think in the supplemental information, for protecting privacy, we actually indicated a couple of different factors that researchers and institutions can consider when they are sort of determining whether to share data through controlled access or through unrestricted access. These include, if you're actually considering to share it through controlled access, whether there might be, specific limitations that stem from things like informed consent or from laws that would need to be followed that might impose sort of restrictions on, subsequent use, as well as things like whether there are privacy risks or privacy concerns that really can't be mitigated by, applying sort of relevant de-identification techniques or even things like certificates of confidentiality. On the other hand, we've also, given people some factors to consider in terms of whether things should be made available through unrestricted access, which would include things like whether people have explicitly consented to doing so. And I think a sort of more specific consideration of the sort of level of risk that would actually be, involved in doing so.
Thanks. Let's see, another question here about DMS plans when the data use is already controlled by a pre-existing data use agreement. For example, secondary data from, some large, administrative health data sets, for example. Taunton, we can start with you.
Sure, yeah. Well, so I think, in those cases, the policy has a number of different, pieces that I think, relate to this. So first off, the policy would not necessarily expect that researchers that are doing secondary data, or a secondary research that involves, analysis of primary data that have already been shared in some way would not be expected to share those data again. Particularly things that are sort of made actually available through things like, government repositories. I've seen some other questions in the chat about things like CMS data. These are not things that we would expect, to be shared again. There's also, I think, a sort of important consideration here that sometimes, secondary research can sort of generate things that would be considered scientific data, and that the policy would sort of normally expect those to be shared as well. But again, in many cases, when you're accessing data, there can be agreements that may be necessary in order to enter into to get access to the data and to do the research in the first place, that may impose, restrictions on how things like derived data, can be shared. And I think the policy has been pretty clear that that's something that we would generally consider to be, potentially justifiable as a sort of a limitation in sharing. But we would also, expect those kinds of things to be disclosed in plans.
Great, thank you. We've heard some concerns about researchers being scooped by sharing their data. We definitely recognize those concerns. How does NIH plan to address this? Let's see. Cindy, would you like to start?
Sure. So I guess the main message is that we would like to see some prospective planning, and that thinking this through at the beginning and thinking about your timelines for when your data will be generated, when you expect to complete your analyses, publish ideally, and that we do, so if you do publish your research, then that would occur before the end of your award, and anything that hasn't been shared at that point, kind of the last opportunity would be by the end of your award. And in terms of compliance, that is really the last date. And so we do understand, we certainly are hearing, concerns about how you can make sure to do what you need to with your data, but we don't really have any kind of new solution now. I'd like to also turn to my opera colleagues to see if they have anything to add, in terms of the compliance piece and the timing there.
No, I don't have anything to add at this point. Looking at Cosmo, if she has anything on her end to add, which she may not, but no, I don't have anything to add regarding compliance. We're going to have more information on how the compliance pieces are going to work in the future, and we'll be communicating that out to all recipients as we have that information available.
Yes, and I'll also just reiterate kind of what Carrie said too, where we definitely hear the concerns, and we will, certainly be taking those challenges into account. And I think someone else in the Q&A had also mentioned something about the possibility of utilizing no-cost extension mechanisms to accommodate some of those concerns. And that is something that our policy colleagues are looking into to make sure that we can address that as part of any compliance guidance.
Thank you. So Cindy, can you talk to us about what accountability measures are in place for ensuring that what people say they're going to do in their plan actually happens? Similarly, for kind of ensuring that folks who access the data are doing so responsibly.
Sure. I'll maybe take the first part of that, and in terms of subsequent access, I might turn it over to Julia for some additional thoughts. And in terms of accountability for making sure that award recipients do what they said they would in their approved plan, again, just kind of coming back to that prospective planning, that we want to make sure that you're thinking through the right way to do this for your particular project, and or providing those details at the beginning, so there can be a shared understanding between the research team as well as the NIH, who's overseeing your award, in terms of what to expect here. So ideally, there would be perhaps fewer surprises at the end, because you know how things should go. In terms of compliance monitoring, what is actually happening in terms of carrying out your plans, we will be updating the RPPR questions to ask about that progress, and this will be the chance for NIH staff to take a look at where you are, and if you are where you thought you would be when you put in your initial plan. And if there are issues at that time, then in general, working together to try and bring you back into compliance if there are any issues, identifying those and dealing with those. The goal is to make sure that scientific data are useful, and if there are any issues impacting that, then we want to make sure that that can occur. And I don't know if my upper colleagues have anything more to add on in terms of compliance. We are, as I think we pointed out earlier, we are still coming up with those compliance monitoring processes, but in essence, we'll be asking the award recipient to report on what they've done at regular intervals, and making sure that is done before the end of the project.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add from a systems perspective, we are going to be updating our notice of award templates to be able to accommodate incorporation of the data management and sharing plans as part of the terms and conditions of award, as well as our funding opportunity announcement templates to incorporate that information as well. So as Cindy and others have mentioned, it will be part of the terms and conditions of award regarding the plan that is approved by NIH staff.
Great, thank you. So we've just got about 5 minutes left, and there's a good question that I'm actually going to answer with my wrap up. So the question is there a help desk or other resources who have questions about the DMS policy? I'm going to, Duran, if you'll throw up those slides, I can I can actually walk folks through some of the resources that I wanted to end on. So we've mentioned extensively that we have this NIH scientific data sharing site. This is really going to be a great place to start and look for resources. We're continually adding pieces to it. So for example, we've got this is a screenshot of the site. We've got a whole section on the data management and sharing policy. We've got a whole section on FAQs related to the data management and sharing policy. And these we're adding to this, as additional information becomes available. There is an email box, it's sharing@nih.gov. And that is a great place to put some questions if you're not already finding the answer with the information that we've provided. We also have a learning page on our site. It's in the About section. And this is where you'll find all of the webinar resources, like the recordings and the resource slides and other, we think, really useful pieces of information for folks to kind of grab and go. So we really encourage folks to go to that this learning page and check out what we've got. Similarly, oops, I meant to go back. I did want to mention that on the news and events part of the sharing website, we actually have a section for latest news, upcoming and past events, and there is a way to sign up to get notified anytime a new news item or a new event is posted. So I know we heard that question. How do I get notified when all this new information is coming out? Go to our news and events and select that you would like to be notified. So that'll send you a quick email anytime that we post anything here. And we're really, every time we add a resource to the website, we're trying to add a little news item in the news feed so you can let us know so you can see kind of what are the changes that have been made. In addition to this news and events page, we've got a number of blogs that we are putting out to keep folks in the loop. Our social media channels are a number of listservs that if you're not already on all these listservs, please do get on them because they're a great way to stay informed. So in closing, I want to sincerely thank all of our attendees for joining us. I want to thank all of our presenters and panelists for taking the time and answering all of these questions. And for our ASL interpreters, our captioners, our technical staff, thank you for making this all happen. And we hope that this information was useful. We encourage you to go back to our webinar 1 materials as well. And to do let us know kind of there's going to be a survey that you can take at the conclusion of this webinar. And we really like to know, what you found useful and what types of things you're still kind of looking for as we near policy implementation. So with that, I'll just say thank you. And we're really happy that you could join us.